Grant Shonkwiler first started making games when he was 12 years old, starting with modding and programming. Since then, he has filled many different roles in the game industry: programmer, lead designer, technical producer, and he is currently a leadership and production consultant. His career has taken him from casual games at Megatouch Games to AAA shooters at id Software and Epic Games. Grant currently runs his own consulting company and is the co-author of Gear Up, Advanced Game Development Practices. Grant also enjoys building communities with the industry, working with the IGDA, and the Game Dev Drink Up. He can also be found throwing himself out of airplanes or on a rugby pitch on the weekends. Grant.
Thank you. So my talk's a little interesting. My talk is about the last 10 years of my professional development and the lessons that I've learned. And I think giving a talk like that can seem a little awkward if you don't know what my background is. And I'm kind of a pretentious person. So I made a video, kind of like a demo reel, showing some of the games that I worked on. And what this does is it'll kind of show you how I've changed different genres and things throughout my career. So enjoy the video. It's just rude. You may be wondering if the ultimate level of pretension is to make a video about yourself, but no, it's a giant picture of your head on the screen so that those in the back know what I look like when you see me later. So yeah, you may have gathered, my name is Grant Shonkwiler. I've been making games for a long time, professionally for, 11 years now, 12 years? But I've been making games since I was 12 years old, so a lot of different experiences, a lot of different learning opportunities within that. So it's important for me to understand who's in the room because that will change a little bit about how I do this talk. So if you are currently making games as your full-time job, raise your hand. Okay. If you want to make games for a living, raise your hand. If you are a student learning game development, raise your hand. Cool. All right. If you're here just because you love video games, raise your hand. Yeah, that should hopefully be everybody in the room. That would be awkward. So it's important as a producer to always have an agenda and for meetings and let people know what we're going to be doing. So here's what we're going to be doing. We just did the intros. You know who I am. I know who you are in a little bit of a way. We're going to shout, which is normally awkward at conferences, but it's going to be real fun because we're at a library, so we're going to yell at each other. We're going to go through the 10 lessons that I've learned in the last 10 years of my career, and throughout that, and then at the end, we're going to go over industry trends. So kind of how you can manage your work and your career as you go through, and then we'll do Q&A. So every talk that I give is interactive because I'm an incredibly easily bored person, and if I sit and listen to somebody talk for an hour, I'm going to get bored, and I don't want you to be bored at me, so what that means is we're gonna have interactive portions. So this first one is going to be weird. I promise you it's weird, but I also promise you it's based in science. So if everybody, if you're willing and able, please stand up. So this is the last talk of the day. You've been learning, you've been filling your brain with useful information, and you're probably thinking about where you're going to eat and what you're going to do tonight, and did you pay your parking and all those things. Lots of things are going through your head right now, and as I said, I'm a pretentious person, and I want you to focus on me. So we're going to do something that I've learned through cognitive science, which is called framing and setting up the situation. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little Skyrim. I liked all the Skyrim references in the talk before me, so my little shout out here. What we're going to do is we're going to think about all those things that are going on outside this room. We're going to bring them to the center, and then on the count of 3, we're all going to scream and push those things out so that we can focus and be present. I know that seems weird, be judgy, but it's going to work. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. Everybody feel better? Okay, sit down, sit down. Thank you. Thank you. I promise you that's not the last interactive portion, but they won't all be that loud. I did that once at a conference, and literally like a cop ran in and was like, "What's going on?" I'm like, "My bad, dude, my bad." Yeah, I'm going to talk about my journey, and my journey started when I started making games when I was younger because of a frustration at how Pokemon, I think it was Red or Blue, was designed. I thought I could make a better game, so I started doing that. And then I decided I wanted to go to a university that would pump me out as fast as possible to start making games, so I went to Full Sail University, where you can get a 4-year degree in 2 years, and it was really important for me to learn as much as I could about the game industry because I wanted to do it all. I wanted to be a designer, I wanted to be a producer, and I wanted to be a programmer. Turns out programmer was the one that you could actually get a job from. So in 2008, I joined a company called Megatouch Games in Philadelphia. They no longer exist, so if you're looking for a job, don't look at Megatouch Games because they're defunct. And I kind of joined at a perfect time. One of the things that I'm going to talk about is identifying trends both from your career perspective and if you're like running a business. And this has been something that I've done in every shift that I've made in my career, is like, what's a trend that I can be involved in and make a name for myself. And I joined Megatouch in 2008, which not only being a great financial crisis going on, but was the birth of touchscreen devices. And also casual games were super duper popular at that time. So I joined a company that had been making casual touchscreen games for over 10 years. If you've ever been in a bar and seen those like machines with like Photo Hunt and stuff, that's what we did. I didn't know what they were either when I joined them, but I lied and said I loved their games. So the first lesson that I learned is to be a sponge, to be like SpongeBob there, which is constantly learning and open to new kind of experiences. So when you start your first job or when you come to a school for the first time, right, you have a couple options. You can be loud and boisterous and the know-it-all, or you can kind of sit back and listen and ask good questions and learn. And that's what I've learned in my career. I'm a very outgoing, loud person. I've learned that the best way to approach a new situation is to just kind of sit back, ask questions, and learn. Because the people around you obviously know more about that current place and the game that they're working on than you would know. So that's what I did. I sat back and I asked lots of questions. I learned a lot of valuable things that I didn't know. This device had just come out. It's the first iPhone, and it really started to change, not only the world but the industry that we worked in. And we kind of had one guy who was just like working on iOS stuff. And the first thing that he taught me, just casually, he was talking about it, and I didn't know, was that like, this is really big, so it won't work, but you've all used a touchscreen device. Your hand covers up parts of it that you're trying to kind of focus on. So I just kind of like heard him and someone else talking about that, like, oh, we have to make sure we don't put things in a place where the player's hand will cover them up. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Fast forward, like probably 2 months later, I was running a test with some new players on a game we were working on, and they weren't noticing something that was really important. It was kind of like the key to the whole game, and I'm like, why are these people idiots? Like, why aren't they noticing this feature? And I was like looking at the video of it, and I realized what was happening was it was taking place in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, and every person was right-handed. The only person who got it was the lefty. And I was like, oh, okay, well, should probably go back to what I remembered and not do that anymore. So we moved it into the middle of the screen and applied particles, and people noticed it. So yeah, first lesson, simple, be a sponge, be like SpongeBob. As I was learning all this information, from my coworkers, I was also corresponding a lot with different people in the industry, reading lots of articles online and emailing people, going to every industry event I could find within driving distance. And I really wanted to be a game designer. That was kind of like my dream, but I didn't know how to do it. So I was emailing all these people, talking to all these people, and finally I was like, okay, I think I can be a game designer. I just have to figure out how to be a game designer, like how to put myself out there and figure this out. And one day our creative director was walking by, and he was like, man, I'm just like stuck. I can't come up with any new ideas. And I was like, this is my chance. I'm gonna do it. And so I was like, I'm just a lowly programmer just coding away, and I jump up and I'm like, hey, I got an idea for a game. And he's like, yeah, man, what's up? And I was like, yeah, it's a great game. Turns out it was the worst game ever. Worst game I've ever pitched. And yeah, so if you know the song "It's Raining Men," "It's Raining Men," that was my idea. Was that you were a woman with a giant purse, and you caught the best parts of men falling from the sky to create your perfect boyfriend. Attributes, not like body parts. Okay, calm yourselves. And he was like, "That's neat. Thanks for that." And then he walked away. And I was like, all right, man, cool. But that's where I learned this lesson, and it's like you have to put yourself out there constantly in your career, because if you don't, you'll never get anywhere, right? And that was kind of a humiliating situation. It was embarrassing because it wasn't a good idea. But fast forward like 4 or 5 weeks later, he came by and he's like, hey, I'm stuck on this problem, this game design problem, and you have a game designer's brain. And I was like, I do? Thank you. And he's like, can you help me with it? And I was like, yeah. And so he like left the problem with me and he said, hey, if you want to contribute, any new ideas, go for it. And that was my first game design credit. And fast forward a few years later, he basically left all of the game design decisions up to me, and I ran all of the game design stuff at that company. So that never would have happened if I hadn't put myself out there. So second lesson is put yourself out there. Be ready for rejection, but just know it can be a little bit embarrassing if there might be worse problems, but usually it's just embarrassing. So I shipped a bunch of titles as a lead game designer. And like I said, I was in charge of game design, and that's when the second trend in my career came in and totally broke everything that I was doing, which was social games. Some of you may have been the people playing Farmville, sending requests on Facebook all the time. I don't hate you. Everyone else does. So the rest of us just were really annoyed by it, but this was a huge thing that shook up the industry in a couple different ways. And I didn't jump on this trend as far as career-wise, but I did learn a lot about it as a game designer. So every game now has some social aspects in it, right? From social media campaigns to sharing things with your friends to using the social graph for like marketing and stuff. But what I really learned from this, not only was it teaching us about free-to-play, which we'll get to in a little bit, but it was teaching us a lot about analytics. And this was my first exposure to using math to understand player behavior. So if you don't know or have never used analytics in a game, basically analytics in games is just like analytics in anything else. Everything you do on Facebook is registered and recorded, and there's math, right? Same with games. Everything you do is recorded and can be put into a report, and we can look at it and kind of see where people are dying, where people are, getting in better combat situations and stuff. There was actually some really great stuff that came out with the new Battlefield. They released a bunch of their heat maps analytics and showed how they were adjusting maps based on areas where players were dying but not killing equally. So these were like alleys where people were just getting killed from far away, but they weren't getting involved in combat, which isn't fun as a player. So it's really interesting. These numbers are really interesting, but the problem is you can look at these numbers and make drastic changes to your game without understanding why the players are doing the things they're doing. So you have to use your game designer brain along with the numbers to figure things out. An example of using numbers to help understand what players are complaining about was on Fortnite, this was many years ago, we were doing a test and all of our players were like, your rifles are terrible. We hate rifles. No one ever uses rifles. And we're like, why? Why is no one using rifles? So we went and looked at the analytics data and realized everyone was using shotguns. And so then we went into a test map, started playing with the shotguns, and realized all of our shotguns were like infinite distance shooting. So you could like snipe people with shotguns from across the map. So yeah, why would you ever use a rifle when the shotgun was good at long range and close range combat? So the next lesson that I learned is a really interesting one. And some of you are younger, some of you are older. One of the interesting things about life is when you're young, making friends is the easiest thing ever. You literally are like, hey, I like your shoes. And then we're best friends, right? Like that's all it takes. That's all it takes. You're like, we're going to be best friends for the rest of our lives. You're going to be in my wedding, But as an adult, it can be a little awkward because you're like, hey, I'm alone at this bar. You want to be friends? But it's really key, right? Making friends is what unlocks the industry. All of my jobs have come because of friendships that I've made with people. Now, you may have heard this referred to as networking, which is like the super professional, like, I want to make money off of you way of referring to it, but it's just making friends. And the simplest way to do that is to ask people questions about themselves, especially in the creative industries. Like, we all want to talk about what we're working on as much as we're allowed to, right? Like, if you come up to me and you're like, hey, what are you working on right now? Then I'm like, oh, well, let me tell you, I'm solving the world problems over here. But that's a great way to get to know people. And, you know, what's really interesting is how making friends unlocked my career. So first, my first job I got by just constantly talking to the HR person at this company. And we're friends. He's one of my mentors now. The next one was one that I developed a friendship with no interest in getting the job. It was a friend of mine was working at Midway Austin, and we became friends. And we would hang out at GDC every year, and we got to know each other really well. And then she went to id Software, and she was like, hey, do you want to come work with me? And I'm like, no, I'm good. And so then she asked me the next year, hey, do you want to come work with me? And I'm like, maybe. I'm kind of really happy. And some of you may be wondering, like, okay, you're making casual games, and someone offered to let you go work on, like, Doom, and you're like, no. For the game designers in the room, you know what I'm talking about. If you're at a company that lets you make your ideas, that happens once in your career. So one of my other friends came through, and he was like, dude, your dream is to make AAA first-person shooters. Why do you keep saying no? And I was like, oh, good point. So friends are really how I got my next job, kind of in two different ways. First off, you know, the friend who realigned me to what my expectations in my life were, and then the one who offered me the job. So friends are important, make friends. That leads me to my next one, which is taking risks. Okay, I was comfortable at the job I was at. I was lead designer. I could make whatever I wanted. And I took a huge risk to go to id Software to work on Rage and Doom. You know, it's moving across the country, it's meeting new people, new company, having to develop rapport with people. But I was also switching my career in a lot of ways. So I was going from game design to production. So now I was responsible for a bunch of programmers who were super smart and way smarter than me, and making sure that they had what they needed and getting their jobs done. So it was a big shift in a lot of different ways. But risk is really, really important, right? It's a lot like putting yourself out there, but as opposed to just, you know, being embarrassed, you can have pretty major nasty side effects, right? You might end up losing your job, your house, your health care, whatever it might be. But risks are important. If you don't take risks, you never grow as a person. Not just in your career. I'm sure you can think of plenty of risks that you've taken that have helped develop you as the person you are. But it's important to learn how to minimize risk in a couple different ways, right? For the producers in the room, we're like, yeah, risk management, that's my bread and butter. But it's not quite that. It is, but it isn't, right? So you know, that first picture is me successfully landing from a skydive. That's what I like to do for fun, and that's crazy, but it's calculated risk, right? Like, I'm not a crazy adrenaline junkie. I'm not a risk taker. I take calculated risks, right? I don't just grab your backpack and go jump off a building or an airplane, right? Like, I have a rig that's like fully approved by the FAA. It's been checked by professionals and all this stuff. It's very calculated. I know exactly the wind speed and the drop speed, all these things that I need to know. It's the same thing when you're taking risks in your career. You know, I always start with a basic pros and cons list. What's the pros? What's the cons? And then I figure out, like, what's the absolute worst thing that can happen if I do this change? Okay, if I do, and that worst thing happens, how do I react to it? So having just a basic plan of how to manage those bad outcomes can make taking risks a lot more easy. So take risks. Like I said, I took a huge risk to go work on my first AAA game, which was Rage. If you don't know about Rage, it was in development for quite a long time, and the real fun thing was that it had a AAA first-person shooter, had a multiplayer component that was being made by an outsourced company, and then they decided to bring it back in-house. I was working on Doom on Doom's multiplayer, and they said, hey, you guys now have to make Rage's multiplayer, and you have like 4 months. So that was fun. I had 12 people on my team, and we made a AAA multiplayer game in like 5 months. But it ended up being a pretty awesome game, and it ended up playing really well. And I learned my next big lesson there, which is don't kill yourself to make video games. And don't kill your team, right? Like the main way to kill your team, if you're wondering, is to run out of coffee like this guy did. That's why he turned into a skeleton. So as a producer, you just make sure they have lots of coffee. But we crunched really, really hard on Rage. We were working, up to 90 hours a week, which is not preferable for any human being. I lost relationships. I didn't see the sun other than driving to work in the morning for 3 or 4 months. And it took a physical toll on my body too. And this is something that I don't ever want to do again, and I don't want to put my teams through. Some fun examples, they're funny now, but when you hear about them, you might be like, that's kind of horrific, but it's okay, you're allowed to laugh. I laugh when I tell these stories. The first one is one of our programmers was celebrating his first anniversary, and he said, hey, can I go, have anniversary dinner with my wife? First off, the fact he had to ask me was really awkward, but yeah, I'm like, dude, go have your first anniversary dinner. And I said, but I may call you if there's like a showstopper bug. And so I did. I called him, and he's like, okay, I'll come back to the office. So his wife drops him off. He's wearing flip-flops. He wore flip-flops to his anniversary dinner. I don't get it either. But he's like wandering up the stairs like a little drunk, and he like trips and like slices his foot open. And he still like comes into the office, and he's like trailing blood behind him, and he's like, what's the bug, man? I'm like, dude. So I told him to sit down at his computer and pulled up the bug. He started working on it, and he put his foot up on the desk, and I applied first aid and bandaged his foot. He fixed the bug, and then we took him to the hospital, and he got like 6 stitches. It's hilarious now, but like, it's a video game, man. We could have waited a little bit. The next one is a fun one. For those of you who don't know, that is a PlayStation 2. Yeah, PlayStation 2 development kit, I think, or PlayStation 3. I can't remember now. No, that's a PS3 dev kit. That's a PS2 on top. That's a PS3 dev kit. Sorry. And we called those pizza boxes because they were like the size of this table, and they were like $20,000 US, I think. We had 2 on our team. And we guarded them. They were in a locked office and stuff like that. And one night, it was about midnight, I hear screaming coming from that office. I'm like, what is going on? And I go in, and one of our programmers is holding it over his head, like screaming, like, I hate you. And I'm like, what? So I like grabbed him and like put it down, then pulled him out, and he had like totally snapped. His brain had just snapped from all the working hours. I ended up putting him in a chokehold and throwing him in the elevator with his keys and telling him not to come back to work for 2 days. Called his wife, told her to take his keys when he got home so he couldn't leave. And that's just what happens, right? There's no way that guy was turning in good code at that point, right? Like he had totally snapped. So you need to make sure you're taking care of your own health when you're working on games and taking care of the health of your team. Look, making games is like, it's my life's calling. I love it. It's absolutely amazing, but we're not trying to save the world. Unless one of you is making a game that's going to solve world hunger or something. If you are, please talk to me. I want to be involved. So the next trend that kind of took off was Kickstarter, crowdfunding. This was really crazy when it first happened because every single indie game that went on Kickstarter got funded. Every one. I think it culminated in the Double Fine game that made like $2 million or something like that. It was crazy, and we were all excited for everybody, and then a few years later, people stopped making the games and just taking the money and being like, we don't actually know what to do with this money, or they realized that they had asked for too little money. And, so the trend has changed a lot. You can still use crowdfunding in a lot of ways. I was actually just talking to a client about this yesterday, and I was saying, look, you can't ask for $500,000 on Kickstarter anymore. It just doesn't really work out. What I usually tell people is you want to ask for around $10,000 to $20,000 and use it as like your marketing budget or a way to kind of finish your game. And if you don't have a full demo available for people to see, your game's never going to get any money at all. So usually what I tell people is kind of use it as raising money to push you into early access or something like that. So that was a fun trend that had started. And at this point, I was working on Doom, so I enjoyed all the Kickstarter games coming out, and I enjoyed giving money to them. But I was in the minds of id Software working on Doom, which was in development for a really long time. I think it was in development for like 7 years. I was obviously not there for the whole time. But there was a reason it was in development for so long, and that was we as a studio were scared of failure. That might sound a little like, oh, that's good. You don't want to fail. But the problem is when you're scared of failure, you can't innovate or do anything interesting because, say I sent the three of you guys out to work on something and you couldn't get it to ever be good, so therefore you never wanted to show it to me because you're scared of me reprimanding you and being like, we're id Software, man. We can't put shit out. Like, no, that's kind of how we felt, right? Like, when you're trying to make a sequel to Doom, like, everything is crap. And so we're like, okay, we got to make something better than this. And we realized that was our problem, that we had a culture of fear of failure. And so we decided to change our culture to embrace failure and to celebrate failure. And this started with a simple thing that we called the Failcorn, which was an inflatable unicorn with a big fail sticker on the back. And we awarded it to people who failed in humorous ways. For example, I won it for trying to move my entire desk on one rolly chair and then dropping my 30-inch monitor and my development kit and exploding them everywhere. The IT department loved me. They're like, cool, we have lots of extra TVs in the back. They put me on a 15-inch monitor for a week just to be like, you messed up. The best one we gave away was an intern on his last week marked the entire repo for deletion and locked 200 developers from working. And we sent all the producers to stand behind him and be like this, and then we still gave him a job. It was really awesome. But what we did was we started to create fail is interesting, right? So when someone got the Failcorn, the head of the studio would come take a picture with them. We'd send an email out to the company and be like, these are the achievements they unlocked. If you won it twice, then you got a different award. I won it twice. I still have the award. So we kind of created this culture of failure, and what that did was we then told teams to go off and figure something out and fail really quickly. Who here's played Doom 2016? Okay, so a couple systems that came out of that is the movement speed, right? You move super fast, you can kind of around everywhere. That came out of that. The ability to not reload, taking reload out of the game, was literally someone I took reload out, and we're all like, yeah, you're right, reloading is not fun. Okay, that makes sense. So we innovated a lot because of the embracing of failure. It's important to embrace failure both at a studio level, but also on a personal level, right? If you're not constantly failing, you're never going to learn. There's a quote that I like and I keep above my desk that says, fail early, fail often, but always fail forward, from John C. Maxwell. So you always got to be failing. So the next lesson leads directly from that last lesson, right? We talked about the risks that the teams took to figure things out. But when we sent the teams out, we told them one main thing: focus on the fun, right? Don't worry about story, don't worry about context, anything. Just figure out what's fun. And this is something that has dominated my career kind of in two different ways. So the first one is focusing on the fun of making your game, right? If you're making a game that is narrative and trying to solve world hunger or whatever, then maybe fun is not, we're not going to talk about that. But most games inherently have to be fun. So if something doesn't add fun to your game, you got to cut it, right? This is one of the hardest things I have to do in my job, both as a consultant and when I was a producer, which is come in, look at people's work and be like, well, here's what you're trying to accomplish, and this, and this aren't fun. And I don't think they're going to be fun, and they're not going to add to your game, so you need to cut it. And that's really hard because people have spent probably hundreds of hours on that. They're passionate about it. They love it. This is like their baby. And you're like, no, it's crap. You gotta get rid of it. And sometimes what that does is that inspires somebody to go off and work on their own and figure out how to make it fun and make it part of the experience. But most times you'll cut it, and within a couple days, everybody's like, that was the right decision. So you have to focus on the fun in that aspect. The second one is about focusing on the fun in your career. I gave a similar talk to this once, and I was talking about focusing on the fun in your career, and this guy looked at me and just started like, I saw his brain break, and he's like, I hate my job. And I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for that to happen. But what I mean by focusing on the fun in your job, you know, you're like, if you haven't made games, you're like, you're making games, it's always fun. That's not really true. There are times that it gets to not be as fun, or you might get bored with what you're doing, right? So I worked on first-person shooters for a while, and then I was bored with making first-person shooters. So I decided to find something that would be fun and interesting and weird and unique, and would challenge me in that aspect. I also get a lot of fun from traveling and meeting new people and moving to new areas. So I decided to find the weirdest, most interesting game I could that was being made in the world, and that turned out to be Fortnite, and Epic Games in Raleigh, which was, you know, pretty awesome. So, you know, sorry. So it's important that you focus on the fun both in the game you're making and in your personal career, right? If you're not having fun with what you're doing, assess if maybe it's time to make a career change, or maybe make a shift in what you're doing at the company you're at. And you might end up working on a game that causes hundreds of people to get divorced. You never know. It's pretty exciting. That's my new rubric for like if my game is successful. How many people get divorced because of it? So the next lesson came early in my career, but it started to get really reinforced when I started working at Epic, which is surrounding yourself with passionate people. The game had been in development for a while when I joined, but no one on the team was like bored with working with it. They were like super passionate about it. So that made me super passionate about it. I ended up hiring a lot of people onto the team, and one of the things that we often looked at was younger people, right? Younger people tend to be a little bit more passionate about making games. They're not jaded like those of us who have been making games for a long time. And you need that balance of young, excited passion with kind of the understanding and logic of people who've been making games for a long time. Now, what I don't mean by that is like I don't hire young people and be like, you get to work 100 hours this week, because they will. I usually am kicking the young people out, like go away, go enjoy life somewhere else. But it's important to surround yourself with passionate people, because when you surround yourself with passionate people, crazy things happen. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that after I talk about this. So free-to-play games, it's League of Legends. They'd been around for a while, and you know, they had really started to gain speed. And I think around 2012 is when League started to get big. Dota started to get big, and that's when all of us in the industry started to kind of stand up and pay attention and be like, oh, these games can make more money than normal games. Maybe we should like see if we can do something like this. You know, free-to-play games are interesting if you've never made one or really learned about them, because they make a lot of money, but what's really fascinating about that is like less than 10% of players usually spend money on your game. And out of that 10%, 1% will spend about 60% of the money on the game. So that means 1% of people are basically sustaining your game. We call those people whales, and that's not like a derogatory term, it's just the term that we use. And so what I always tell people when you're working on a free-to-play game is you kind of want to get feedback from those whales and figure out what it is that they want to spend money on, and keep kind of putting time and effort into building those things out, right? So you gotta build lots of hats. Usually is what people want, hats and characters. So my number one lesson though with free to play is don't be evil unless you're making your game for China, and then be evil as you want because they're just crazy over there. They make games completely different than we do. This is my brightest slide, George Curioso, Curious George. So one of the things that I've learned throughout my career and that really helped with the craziness of the next thing I'm going to talk about is being curious, always being curious. What I've found throughout studying history, which is one of my passions, is that anyone of consequence, anyone who's done anything significant in the world, from Leonardo da Vinci to Marie Curie, is inherently curious about everything. They're like, why is that color? Why is the woodpecker's tongue the shape that it is, right? And as game developers, we also have to be really, really curious about the world around us. From the way your neighbor takes out the trash to the way that traffic converges in the tunnel can all be a game, right? And I think that it's important that we realize, people who want to make games and people who are making games, we are storytellers inherently. That's what we're doing. We're telling stories non-verbally in a lot of ways, and that's important. That's very important, and I think it's awesome that we get to do this. And one of the things that I encourage young game designers especially is to be curious about the world and figure out how to tell the stories of people who aren't currently being told through game development. And so that kind of led to, like, my curiosity and the curiosity of some of the passionate people on my team led to us making a really weird game called Battle Breakers for Epic. Most of you probably have not heard of it because it was a game that we made for China. I was really curious about the Chinese free-to-play market and how they're totally evil. And when I say they're evil, basically everything is pay to win in China, right? Like everything. Like here, you don't sell a gun that makes people way better. In China, like, you sell it for like $50 and everybody buys it, and they're like, look at my sweet gun, and you're like, okay, that's cool. So I got really curious about that, and some of the designers on my team got really curious about kind of designing a game for the Chinese market, and some of the artists were like, well, I'd like to kind of figure out the art style that isn't Western. And so we formed a little indie team within Epic to work on this, and we were all super passionate about it. We worked really hard, and ended up making something really different and really interesting. But it was because of our passion and our curiosity that made us want to make that game. While I was working there, right, like, I basically formed an indie studio within Epic for about a year, and then we all went back to working on Fortnite. And indie games are something that is really inspiring, and it's a trend that luckily hasn't died and has only continued to grow. And one of the things that I tell people is, if you don't want to make indie games, you still need to play indie games because they get to do all the fun things. They get to do all the interesting things. They get to figure out mechanics that the rest of us then steal and put into AAA games. So thank you, indie developers, for all of that. These are a bunch of really successful indie games, and if you've played these games, you can look at them and see a unique mechanic that each of them did that was eventually brought into a larger game like an Assassin's Creed or something like that. So there's lots of room for indies to continue to make games. The thing I always encourage indies to do is not make another 2D platformer. No offense if you're doing that, but there's a lot of those. But if you are, make sure you're doing something interesting and unique, and then send it to me because I want to be inspired and then steal your ideas. The next one is about surrounding yourself with good people. This is an interesting picture because these are a bunch of people that went to the same school as me, but we all went for different things, recording arts and things like that. And the only thing we have in common is we all make entertainment. We all went to the same school. You can see me in bright yellow in the back because obviously I wanted to stand up. But I surrounded myself with these people because they're good people. And eventually we all started collaborating and working on stuff together, the woman who's down in the front, she works in marketing and entertainment, and next thing I knew, we were using UE4 to make this marketing thing for Best Buy, and we only did it because we're good people. We like working together, and ultimately this is kind of the most important thing I can teach you about games and the game industry is that most of the people in the game industry are pretty cool. They're pretty good people, and ultimately we're all just trying to bring a little joy and happiness to the world. And you may think that the most important thing that you're going to do is work on this hit game like Fortnite or Call of Duty or something like that, but ultimately it's about the people that you meet, and you need to cling to these people and use them as support as you move through the industry, because it's very volatile. You can look in the last 2 or 3 weeks alone at the hundreds of people that have been laid off. But if you find these people, you might start businesses with them. You might do something radical and change the industry or change the world. So when you meet somebody who you're like, hey, you're a good person, I'm a good person, we kind of match up on this. Cling to those people and don't let them go. So what I want to do with this next portion is talk about the trends that are currently happening in the industry and how you can adjust your career or maybe your game or your indie company to kind of gravitate towards those trends. The first one is near and dear to my heart and has made a lot of my friends very rich. Not me. I'm not bitter or jealous. It's cool. And that's cosmetics. This is just a quick sheet that I found online of a bunch of the cosmetics from Fortnite. And what's crazy about cosmetics is they've been around for like 5 years now. They started with a lot of like free-to-play games. And they've only gotten more ridiculous, not only in the way they look, but in how crazy people are willing to be for them, not only to pay for them, but to work really hard for them. So, there's people who will grind for 500 hours to get like a certain pet, or they'll pay $50 for this exclusive item that's only on sale today and then we'll sell again in 2 days. So there's a couple of lessons with this kind of, ooh, keeps cutting out, that's weird. There's a couple lessons with this, and the first one that I always like to tell people, again, come back to, is don't be evil. Don't use cosmetics as an advantage, right? You shouldn't have cosmetics that make a person invisible or harder to see or something if you're a shooter game. The second one is that you should do direct acquisition. So loot boxes used to be the thing, but now a lot of European countries are like, that's gambling. And we're like, oh, you finally figured that out? Yeah, it's been gambling all along. So we're kind of getting away from loot boxes and doing direct acquisition, which makes people wonder, well, how do we incentivize people to buy things? Well, you tell them it's exclusive and it's only for a few days, right? So you have this thing right here, and you're like, oh, this is only on sale for Wednesday, and it's exclusive, and people are like, and then next Wednesday you're like, it's Wednesday again, it's on sale again, and people are like, I need it. So that's kind of the way to do it. My friends that are still working at Epic called 8 o'clock, which is when they refresh the store. They call it money o'clock, because that's when people are like, oh, it's new in the store and it's exclusive. So I could give a huge talk about this, but that's kind of the basics. So the next trend is VR. It's something that I was really involved in the early days, working with John Carmack on the Oculus stuff. I'm not super involved now. I've worked on a couple games, but it's changed a lot, and there's been some huge announcements just in the last few months that are going to change this industry. Some people think, oh, is VR dead? Like, that's like the most common question I get from non-game developers. Like, gamers are like, is VR dead yet? Did we kill it? And I'm like, no, it's not. VR is continuing to grow. Almost more so in non-game spaces than in game spaces. For example, I was in New Zealand and I ended up talking to a bunch of Air New Zealand people who are working on VR apps for their long-haul flights, which if you've ever seen a room full of people using VR, the idea of an airplane full of people using VR is totally terrifying, but, might be cool, I guess. So there's a couple big problems with VR. The first one is obviously the cost of barrier of entry, which I think is going to change with some of the announcements that have just come out. But will continue to get cut in half basically every year for the rest of VR's existence until probably about 3 or 4 years from now. It'll be like $100 to get a full VR rig. But the second problem is one that no one has figured out how to solve, which is inherently people don't like to look stupid. That looks real stupid. So that's something that we have to solve, or else everyone will just play in their bedrooms. That leads to AR, and AR obviously has the exact same problem. You look real stupid. AR is kind of split into two things. We'll start with wearables, and then we'll go to the other side of AR. So obviously wearables are the new hit, the new hot thing that everybody wants to be involved in, like the Magic Leap here. Google Glass back in the day was AR, but I think things are going to continue to evolve just like VR. It's not going to really be popular, though, until it's just like wearing a pair of glasses, right? And then it's creepy because you don't know that someone's in AR, but that's when wearable AR is really going to take off, or if they're contact lenses or something like that. If you're interested in getting involved in this space, starting a company or something, I do actually recommend it because there's not a lot of game companies involved, and the growth in this space is going to be huge in the next 5 years. The second side of AR is the one that probably every person in this room has used, which is this. Who in here played Pokemon Go? It's probably the biggest AR game of all time. Games like that are huge, and they're not going to go away, and I keep talking to lots of companies that are making more stuff like that, so that type of AR is going to keep happening. People also, when I give this slide, like to bring up mixed reality. I'm kind of lumping mixed reality in with AR here. So the next one is something that I really like as a developer and as a game player is kind of interesting, but can also be really frustrating, which is early access games. Fun fact about this picture, the first time I ever looked at the early access page, it used to say see blank number of games, and it was like 50 games. There's now so many games in early access that they just changed it to say, see the games, because there's a lot of them. I think there's like close to 1,000 now on Steam. So the interesting thing about early access is that as a developer, it's awesome, because you're getting data really quickly and feedback from players all the time, and you can adjust and change, and you can start to grow this groundswell. As most of you know, Fortnite was an early access game, technically still is an early access game for Save the World, and it went into early access in December of 2014. So from December 2014 until its launch in July 2017, it was in early access the whole time. Started with 10,000 players and grew to close to 500,000 players in early access. What we did in that was just learn a lot of things, use analytics, test things, make things really terrible on purpose and see what people think, and then adjust it to make it good, things like that. The main thing that I tell people is if you're in early access, use it to build groundswell, right? Don't use any marketing money you have to spend it while you're in early access. Wait until you're getting the retention rate that you expect, the stickiness of the game, to be at before you start spending those marketing dollars. The main two things that I always tell people in early access that you want to test for is stickiness, which is like, retention, people wanting to come back and play the game again and again. And then the second one is UX, the user experience, the usability of the game. Those are the two things you want to use it for. The next one is games as a service, which I did not know was gas until I Googled games as a service slide. On this one. So pretty much every game is a game as a service now. Gone are the great years of when we would publish a game and push it out the door and go on vacation for a month. I miss those days already. But now, right, like you push a game out and you have a day 0 patch, and then you have the next patch, and then you have DLC 1, and then you have costume pack 1, and then this, right? Like every game is a game as a service. Even single player games now have constant updates and constantly changing. So if you're starting to make a game, you have to think about how long is this game, are you going to support this game? Not only if it's this multiplayer game, how long are you going to let the servers be alive, but if it's a single player game, how long are you going to be fixing bugs and platform issues and things like that? If your game's awesome and is making tons of money and continues to make tons of money, then keep it as a service as long as you can. If you want to start working on something else, spin up another team and have them focus on fixing all the problems and releasing content for your game. I've known of companies to have like 1 or 2 developers working on a game for like up to 5 years after, because they're still making money off of it, so why not? The last one is crazy, esports. Esports has been around for, I don't know, probably 30 years, back in the Nintendo days. But in the last 5 years, it's really grown a lot. I'm not super involved in this space, so I'm sure there's other people who can speak more intelligently to it. But I can speak from a game design standpoint. If you want to make an esport, that's not your decision. The community decides if your game is an esport. The first thing you can do is make a game fun to play. And the second thing is fun to watch. If your game is fun to play and fun to watch and competitive, then the community will start to decide if it should be an esport, and then you start building things into that. What you don't want to do is invest a bunch of time into replay software or things like that, and then the community's like, well, your game isn't fun, so why would it be an esport? It's been interesting. Fortnite's a great example of a company reacting to demand from players to be an esport. The game was never designed to be an esport. Now, luckily, Paragon was designed to be an esport, and then the community was like, this game is not fun. But they made all those tools, and then they just brought them into Fortnite. So yeah, if you want to make an esport, good luck. There's a lot of people out there, but the esports arena is growing. I was at a bar the other day. I don't have television. I was at a bar the other day, and Overwatch was on TV, and my fiance yelled at me because I was just like, why? It's like 6 o'clock at night. Why is Overwatch on television? And it's just awesome. It's great. Things are growing. Okay, so that's it for me. Thank you very much. There's my contact information. I have a Twitter that I don't use. I just put it up there because I think it's hilarious. And then I have an email. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I think we have maybe no time for questions. So probably email me or find me afterwards. My kind of last thing that I have to say is I do believe that being a game developer is a great career, a great calling, and we all have to learn to make the industry better, more inclusive, more exciting, and it's up to each of us to be part of changing the world. So thank you all for coming and listening to me talk.